Next is Leviticus chapter 23, verses 1 through 27, 34, and 20 through 27, verse 34. We're going to focus on 23, 4, 5, 10, 11, 15, and 16, and 25, 11 through 13. Our key verse: Ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. And that's Leviticus 25:10. The application is that the student will see that the special holy days of Israel symbolize spiritual events which may be encountered by present-day believers. That's what they're celebrating through these feasts. We need to celebrate still today. Keep in mind, keep it in our memory. As usual, if anybody's got anything you want to say or add, feel free to jump in. Seeking the text. When God's people gather together, it is special. Whether we gather for regular worship services with our church family, periodic association meetings with sister churches, an ordination service for a new minister, or a simple Christian fellowship, when the basis of our gathering is the honoring of Jesus, we enjoy a sweet spirit of unity. True growth in the faith cannot easily happen unless God's people spend time in each other's physical presence with their focus upon Him in worship. It should come as no surprise then that God would prescribe periodic gatherings of His people in which they would enjoy fellowship and worship Him. God calls these gatherings holy convocations. That's Leviticus 23:2. Read that real quick. Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feasts of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations. Each of these are my feasts. So certainly God's people are free to get together whenever they want, but these specified feasts would be consecrated for worshipful purposes, wherein God would be worshipped and served. People tend to gather and have a good time every chance they get. Sometimes they gather because they like the same sports team or band. When God's people gather for worship, when God's people gather for worship, He should always be the focus. Israel was to set aside the Sabbath every week in order to rest and focus on God. In addition to this weekly time, God told Moses He wanted His people to set aside several dates on their calendars in which they would rejoice in Him. 3 times in the spring, Israel was to set aside time for holy convocations. God's people were to celebrate the Passover, commemorating their miraculous delivery from slavery in Egypt by the hand of God. Beginning the next day, they were to celebrate the very next day, they begin to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's Leviticus 23, 3 through 8 describes that. This feast would remind them of their hasty escape from Egypt, symbolizing the fact that their dough did not have time to rise. Those two right there, Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread, were usually kind of considered by the Jewish people one feast because one just went right into the other. Still, in the Bible, it's listed as 2 separate feasts. Then 50 days after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Israel was to celebrate the Feast of First Fruits, which they would bring offerings, including a sheaf of newly harvested barley, to gratefully give thanks to the Lord and dedicate the rest of their produce to Him. And that's covered in Leviticus 9 through 14. 23, 9 through 14. Read that. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye shall come into the land which I give unto you, and shall reap of the harvest thereof, ye shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And ye shall offer that day, when ye wave the sheaf, a he lamb without blemish of the first year for a burnt offering unto the Lord. And the meat offering thereof shall be 2/10 deals of fine flour mixed with oil, an offering made by fire unto. Alan, is that you?
I don't think so. I parked over that way.
Oh my God.
I wouldn't be surprised. I've done it before.
And the drink offering thereof shall be of wine and the fourth part of him. And ye shall eat neither bread, nor parched corn, nor green ears, unto the selfsame day which ye have brought an offering unto your Lord. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. In 7 days and a week after this, Israel would celebrate the Feast of Weeks, known in the New Testament as Pentecost. That's covered in Leviticus 23:15-22. Now at this feast, Israel would bring a sacrificial offering, a grain offering, a drink offering, as well as bread, giving thanks to God for the successful harvest. So at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or at the Feast of First Fruits, a lot of F's there, isn't there? They were celebrating their harvest, the beginning of their harvest, and then at the Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, they're celebrating a successful harvest. And 3 times in the fall, Israel was to set aside times for more holy convocations. First, they would celebrate the Feast of Trumpets, in which they rest, present special offerings to the Lord, sound trumpets, which would remind the people that the Day of Atonement was coming soon. So here we're having a feast to celebrate an upcoming feast. Almost like Toyota. Toyota has meetings to plan meetings, so it's kind of along this same line. Next came the Day of Atonement, and Israel would approach this day with great penitence and reverence for atoning sacrifices which would be offered for the people. That's Leviticus 26-32. And lastly, the Feast of Tabernacles would be celebrated at the end of the fruit harvest to give thanks to God, but also to dwell in tents, remembering their wilderness days when they first came out of Egypt. And that's Leviticus 33-33-43. I didn't add them all up, but in this Feast of Tabernacles alone, 199 in the 8 days that this lasted, 7 days plus the 8th day, 199 animals were sacrificed in this 1 week alone. I didn't add up all of them together, but it's quite a bit. Of course, I guess you think about how many people the Israelite nation, it's not that many, I guess. Still a lot of animals, so yeah. Every day the number would drop by one. They started out at I think they started out with like 29 animals, and then it would go to 28, 27, work right on down. A lot of animals though. So in all these holy convocations, God himself would be the central focus of the crowd. These feasts coincided with Sabbath days, so people would be very careful to rest with intentional emphasis on what would be the most pleasing to God. Of course, there would be food and fellowship involved, which would strengthen God's people, but only insomuch as God received all the glory for the gathering. Now, these holy convocations would unify God's people around their shared heritage of faith and prepare them for ongoing conquests of faith. Christians can learn some powerful lessons from today's text. In prescribing these convocations, God desired that his people gather for specific worshipful purposes. Whether we get together with our families, church members, or other Christians, we should seek opportunities to focus on who God is, what he has done, and how we'll serve him in the future. So the question here on the side is, what do the gatherings of Israel tell us about how God desires to work in his people? I think he wants to be recognized. He wants you to remember he wants to help you succeed what I put down, but he also wants you to remember where the help come from. Be recognized as the giver of all things. He wants to see his people succeed. But he also wants them to be thankful for it.
He wants us to fellowship too.
Yeah. You know, we've mentioned that before, we're seeing less and less people want to come to church. And not just us, all churches. Everybody I talk to is having the same problem. Especially since COVID, with people want to stay home, let's watch it on TV now. This is God, one way God wants showing it, he wants us to get together, you know. I want you to congregate the fellowship. All right, searching the text. Remember what God has done. It's Leviticus 23, 4 and 5. These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons. In the 14th day of the first month, at even is the Lord's Passover. So when it came time for God to deliver his people from slavery in Egypt, it was such a momentous occasion that he had Moses commemorated forever by starting their national calendar with the time of their escape. After 9 plagues did not convince Pharaoh to release the Jews, God knew the 10th plague of the death of every firstborn would compel him to send them away. To avoid the destroyer, this is described in Exodus 12:23, that would pass through the land, God's people painted their doorposts with the blood of spotless male lambs. Then they feasted on the roasted lamb along with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, ready to leave the land. Death visited every house except for the homes on which the blood was painted. When God saw the blood, he passed over the house. This feast was to be observed every year to commemorate Israel's deliverance from death and escape to freedom by God's almighty hand. That's Exodus 12, 1 through 14. So why did God want Israel to celebrate the Passover every year? God certainly did not want his people to have the victim mentality, dwelling in past hurts or giving excuses for bad behavior because of their time of oppressive rule in Egypt. Instead, God wanted them to remember their past so that their focus would be on his deliverance of them. You know, that's something nowadays, you see that a lot of people want to blame their past, their childhood, different things. We've got to do, like the Passover, is to celebrate the deliverance of the bad things that happened. And, you know, when I was a kid, when Dad was drinking and stuff, I saw some things that a really young kid didn't need to see, but I don't dwell on that. I dwell on the fact that God saved Dad and took our family out of that. That's the positive thing of all this stuff. That was a glorious occasion, and that's the way we got to look at everything in life. We don't look at the bad stuff. Look at what God's done to deliver you out of it. So instead, God wanted them to remember their past so that their focus would be on his deliverance of them. God did not intend the Passover to be an occasion to relive past despair, but to relish in past deliverance. So when Israel took time to intentionally focus on how God had been faithful in their past, their time most certainly turned into a moment of corporate worship, magnifying God for his mercy and grace. The same is still true when his people take time to remember his mighty works today. Every time we open our Bibles, we read historical accounts of God interacting with his people, rescuing them from sin and restoring them to his glorious purposes. Additionally, when members of God's churches gather to observe the Lord's Supper, our experience turns from some somber reflection on the broken body and shed blood of Jesus to reverent rejoicing that his sacrifice delivers us from sin. We would be wise to always take time to remember the salvation God has worked on our behalf. The question here is, why is it so important to take the time to remember what God has done? Why is it important to remember that?
Because we tend to forget. Israel forgot a lot.
Yeah.
Certainly, the Lord's Supper is important. Attending church is important.
Yeah.
So I've heard messages about that before, but we tend to forget. We need reminded. We need encouraged. We need, I think it was O.L. Shepherd. Someone told him, said, I don't, either O.L. Shepherd or Mark, someone told him, well, you only have 2 messages. And so praise the Lord, there's one more than Paul had. But it's all about Jesus.
That's right.
Everything comes back to Him.
I don't care if you do have but 2 messages, you get something different out of them every time, won't you?
That's something I've had a hard time preaching with. Is when I go to preach, it's like I feel like I'm just being repetitive. But in all honesty, I mean, it all points back to the cross. It's good to be repetitive because there's someone that hasn't heard it.
It's got to be about Him.
I wrote down a reminder that it's also a reminder that He will always take care of us.
Amen.
We always need to remember that He was a sacrifice for our sins.
Yeah.
And He made a way for us to be saved and go to heaven.
Like this last, don't necessarily need to be remembering the broken body on the cross as the salvation that was worked on our behalf through that broken body on the cross. So give thanks for what God has provided. Leviticus 23, 10, 11, 15, and 16. Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when ye be come into the land which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, then ye shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest unto the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you on the morrow after the Sabbath. The priest shall wave it. And ye shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that ye brought the sheaf of the wave offering. 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath shall ye number 50 days, and ye shall offer a new meat offering unto the Lord. So when someone plants a garden for the first time, it's very common for them to watch closely to see the onset of new fruits or vegetables. As soon as the first fruit or vegetable begins to grow, the gardener will take great care to make sure it's safe. Then comes the proud moment when the gardener plucks the first produce from the garden. The garden might produce hundreds or thousands of fruits and vegetables afterwards, but the very first produce is special and makes the gardener exceptionally thankful. This is how God expected His children to be when they were able to produce food on their own. When Israel finally arrived at the Promised Land, God prescribed them to bring offerings of the very first of the harvest. The first heaps of barley would be gathered and weighed before the Lord as a way to give thanks to God in worship. As the harvest progressed, Israel would continue to bring offerings to the Lord in worship. These offerings would represent the first and best the people could offer and would be dedicated to the Lord before the rest of the harvest would be gathered. This is a demonstration of faith that God had provided what they needed and will continue to provide as they committed their best to Him. I did a little research on barley. I always read about barley in here, but I've never actually laid eyes on barley that I know of. I've always heard of it, but mostly it's been used in making of beer. Apparently they use it about like wheat. They made bread, and so you make soups and everything out of it. So pretty well-rounded, all-around usable vegetable. I guess it's a vegetable, wheat and grain. I didn't know anything about barley. So when we give our tithes and offerings for the first of our income, we demonstrate the same kind of faith in the Lord to provide. We can freely commit to Him what He asks because it belongs to Him already. God does not need our offerings since He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He does look at our hearts and expects us to offer the sacrifices of thanksgiving, performing our vows. That's Psalms 57 through 15. Like Israel, let us regularly offer God what He requires with hearts full of thankfulness. So we be freely giving our tithes. So the question here is, why should we regularly give thanks for what God has provided? Why do you want to give thanks to God?
Because he provided all those things.
Because he's good. Where would we be without him?
He deserves it.
Forget.
Yeah. And we people forget, you know. I'll put down the tithe and verbally thank him. Tell others what he's done for us. Spread the word what he's done for you. Got you out of bed this morning. Even this evening.
That's in his word that he would supply every need.
Yeah. Just need to be thankful.
We would honor him.
Trust God to honor obedience. Leviticus 25:11-13. A jubilee shall that 50th year be unto you. Ye shall not sow, neither reap that which groweth on its of itself in it, nor gather the grapes in it of thy vine undressed. For it is the Jubilee, it shall be holy unto you. Ye shall eat the increase thereof out of the field. In the year of this Jubilee ye shall return every man unto his possession. So every 50 years in the nation of Israel, God would require something special. Over the course of 50 years, it would be likely that some families would run into hard times while others became prosperous. Some would need to commit themselves to be indentured servitude, or even sell their family's property to survive. But when the 50th year arrived, God intended for the land to rest an additional year, and for everyone bound to servitude be released, having their homestead returned to them as well. Following this law would reduce the likelihood of families amassing large wealth or estates, and would help in preventing their oppression of fellow Israelites. The goal in establishing the year of Jubilee was to make sure God's people did not wrong each other, which is Leviticus 25:14-17. The land belonged to the Lord. He was able to make it produce enough to feed his people throughout the times of rest. That's 25:20-22. The people should not worry about how they would survive. Instead, God expected them to concern themselves with the reverential obedience to him, trusting that he would always take care of them. Doing the right thing is not always the easiest thing. Obeying God requires sacrifice. Demonstrating the love of Christ to our neighbor means denying ourselves first and sacrificially meeting the needs of others. How are we to know whether God will honor our obedience and provide our needs? We must trust him to provide just as Israel trusted him to take care of them in the year of Jubilee, even though the land would not have been farmed for 2 straight years. God knows what we need. We must simply trust him more than we trust the natural order of things. We're free to release material blessings for the benefit of our neighbors, knowing that God will take care of us and honor our obedience to him. I wonder if anybody in the Jewish nation still practice that. I haven't heard of any. The question here is how can we hold our possessions loosely and trust God to bless good stewardship? How can we hold our possessions loosely and trust God to bless good stewardship? I want to start with by tithing.
I was gonna say that's a big thing there. A lot of people will look at it and say, "Well, I can't afford to do that," but what you're really saying is that God can't bless you.
Yeah.
You know, we give to him and he blesses. I found that to be true a long time ago.
Years ago, I really struggled with it, just lack of faith on my part, worried when times was very tight for us, and I have since found that I don't care how tight times get, if you just go ahead and tithe, it's just like that money was never there to start with. You know, everything still plods right along. Heard a guy say one time, your tires on your car last longer, and I firmly believe that to be true.
And Jeff said that before, and I believe it.
I do believe it. The food in your cabinet lasts longer. I don't know how, but it does. It's a lot good Lord takes care of it. But it is a step of faith sometimes, especially when times is tight. It is. It's a test of faith. But I think it's a good proof of our faith to him, or our love to him.
How can you hold your possessions loosely? Be a giving person.
Yeah.
We realize that it's not ours anyhow. We're just a steward of what God's given us. The day we die, it's going to go to somebody else.
Yeah.
You ever seen a first quarter before?
No.
You used to see a lot of hearses fixed up driving around. You don't see them much anymore. I don't know.
They've always.
Yeah.
There's a group in Tornado for people that collect hearses.
Okay.
The car club.
All right, setting the application. These feasts prescribed for the nation of Israel are not in effect for the modern day Christian. Jesus fulfilled the pictures of sacrifice these ceremonies projected. The principles behind the feasts are very much applicable to Christians today. As God required his people to remember the rescue from slavery through his miraculous hand, he required Christians to remember our salvation through the work of Jesus Christ on Calvary. As God prescribed festivals in which his people brought their first fruits and committed them to him in thankfulness, God prescribes we bring him tithes and offerings from the first and best that we have with thankfulness. As God detailed a year of release every 50 years to make sure his people did not oppress one another, he commands that we love one another through sacrificing our time, energy, and resources, trusting him to provide us with what we need. Like Israel, we are God's chosen people, standing distinct in the midst of an unbelieving world. Remember what he has done, give thanks for what he has provided, trust him to honor your stewardship of what he's given you. The world is watching to see the genuineness of our faith. That's a truer statement never spoken right there. The world is watching to see the genuineness of our faith. Even when you don't think it, people's watching. Question here, what does this text tell us about how we can represent God well? How can we represent God well?
Faith.
Be faithful, be thankful.
The world does watch us, so they know if we go to church on Sunday morning.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
I have a testimony.
That's a testimony to those that are staying home.
First time I met Kermit Tyree, I introduced myself. He said, "Yeah, I know you." He said, "I see you pass your house going to church every." He didn't know me, but he'd already picked up that I was coming to this church, you know. People notice a lot. All right. Anybody got anything to add?